Oh, so nice to be with you all. See a lot of friendly faces and wonderful, very old friends. And yeah, we're in terrible times. And I'm sure we all have bits and pieces of information that we've been hearing about Trump's transition team and how he's already going against so much of what he campaigned about, even though while he was campaigning, he was going against what he was campaigning about. You know, all of this drain the swamp, get rid of the lobbyists, and then he's hired the lobbyists, and all of this ideas of getting the outside of the Beltway people, and they're all inside the Beltway people, and then he's got teams that are competing with each other on what their ideologies are, and it's kind of why he got Reince Priebus as his chief of staff, and then he's got Steve Bannon, my God, as his chief advisors, who are going to be totally at odds with each other. So sparks are already flying, and people have asked a lot, well, what does this mean for foreign policy? And I put on my Facebook page, I will only sink into a state of despair if John Bolton gets put into a high position of government. Could you remember how awful he was as an ambassador, just like the worst face of U.S. quote diplomacy, and now they're talking about him as Secretary of State. Yeah, they're vying for that. And anyway, we can't sink into despair no matter who he adds onto his team, because we've already sunk into despair with him.
Maybe it's bad enough that we'll get Elizabeth Warren as our first female president.
She would have been probably if she'd run this time. But, you know, so just some general comments, and we can share this in the discussion about what it might mean. You know, let's admit there were a couple of good things that Donald Trump said while he was campaigning when it had to do with foreign policy issues. He did really launch into a tirade against the Iraq War, saying that it was the worst mistake, and that President Bush lied to the American people, knowing they were not weapons of mass destruction. He, most importantly, I think, has talked about wanting a decent relationship with Russia. And no matter what we might want to say about Putin, we don't want a war with Russia. And that was actually a possibility when we thought about Hillary Clinton as president, with the way that she was demonizing Putin during the campaign, and the way she talked about a no-fly zone in Syria that could have meant a direct confrontation with Russia. There were things that he said that he would then take back. I mean, he said that NATO was obsolete, which I cheered and thought, wow, what a great thing. And then he said, no, those countries should just pay more, their fair share. He did say that the Saudis were the biggest terrorists in the world, spreading terrorism. And I loved it on the in the debate when he said to Hillary Clinton, do you remember? He said, how could you take money from these people? You should give back the money that you took for your foundation from the Saudis. She never answered that one, but it was great that that came up. So there were some good things. Then there are some awful things. Just his personality. The kind of guy you don't want with a hand on the nuclear button. There's the things he said about waterboarding's okay, and I'd go further, that torture is okay, that it's okay to kill the families of quote terrorists, we would say suspected terrorists, because that would be a good deterrent, that he would bomb the shit, he did say, bomb the shit out of ISIS without thinking what that means in the context of urban warfare. And he did talk about increasing the military. Our military has been hollowed out. The military that gets the vast majority of our discretionary funds, larger military by far than any other country. And he says it's been hollowed out, that we need a bigger Air Force, we need a bigger Army, we need more Marines. And that's why the one of the reasons that the stocks of the weapons industry went right up the minute that Donald Trump's victory was announced. So, these are just some of the things, and anybody want to throw out any of the other things that you said during the campaign?
Build a wall.
Build a wall, which of course does not bode well for people on either side of that border. Denies climate change, and now there are talks going on right now in Marrakesh, and the world community is just appalled about will the U.S. pull out of agreements that were agreed upon in Paris, and what does that mean?
Oh, I was gonna say Mexicans are racist, but just one of his many, hateisms, thank you.
Yeah, and let's remember that President Obama was the deporter-in-chief,
Yes.
and now things look even worse. Down to 3 million, yeah, he took it down from 11 to 3 pretty quickly, but, people are living in even more fear than they've been living in, undocumented in this country. Any other, Trump? The Iran deal, that's a very important one, thank you. The Iran deal is very contradictory. He says he wants good relations with Russia. Russia has been working with Iran. The Iran deal, he said, is the stupidest, the worst deal ever. And he was going to rip it up first on day one. Then he was going to change it. And never quite acknowledge that it's a multinational agreement. And you can't just rip it up by being one country. But he could do a lot of harm to that. He could not lift the sanctions that are supposed to be lifted. In fact, he could increase sanctions. He could put sanctions through U.S. banks on the other countries, even the other signatories of the deal that are doing business with Iran. And he could certainly make the hardliners in Iran strengthened and have them pull out of the deal, which would be terrible. So that being the signature foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration, the Iran nuclear deal, it is very dangerous to hear him talk about that.
And might did that to APAC.
Right. Oh, and then Israel, the things that he said about Israel. So you might remember the first he said, I would be a and then he went even further and he said the settlements should keep going. And then he went even further and said he would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and with the U.S. embassy. So, a lot of bad stuff. NAFTA. So NAFTA, one of the things that he won on was his position around trade, and that was, I think, a really major reflection of the hollowed out manufacturing base of this country, and the people in key states who said, look at where we're living. There's no jobs, no future for young people, and NAFTA had a lot to do with that, and the Democrats had a lot to do with supporting these free trade agreements. And those of us in the room, I know some of you, we worked hard against these free trade agreements, knowing that it would be a race to the bottom in terms of jobs, in terms of the environment, but that's come back to haunt the Democratic Party. He wants to reinstate the coal industry. On the other hand, we have new movements that we didn't have before. And we have young people that maybe were involved in the environmental movement, maybe were involved in immigrant rights movement, and around the peace issues, I would say the only movement where there were significant numbers of young people were around Palestine. Because that issue is quite, please turn off your phones. Quite a hot issue on campuses. But you all probably concur with me when I say the peace movement was one of the first. Well, that the Obama administration coalition really killed the peace movement. And there are some centers like this that continue, but a lot of them just folded up around the country. A lot of peace groups, United for Peace and Justice was a coalition of over 1,500 groups, and most of those groups aren't around anymore. I know Code Pink used to have hundreds of chapters all over the country. Might have a few dozen now. Membership, I gotta remember to pass around the sign-up sheet. Is somebody passing around now? Yeah, in my purse. In that pink backpack there. We have about half the number of people we've had before in terms of mailing list. So the things have gotten hard in terms of getting people to pay attention to the peace issue, and we are going to have to find ways of making that change in this next administration, and I hope that's what we have really focus on in terms of the discussion. But I did want to talk about Saudi Arabia and how that fits in here. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so hard to get people to focus on the peace issue is because it's not this really clear issue like don't go invading Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. But it's been all of these different wars going on at the same time, young people feeling like this is just the way it is, over 15 years of war and no end in sight. But that it's been so hard to get a handle on how do you confront the military-industrial complex, which is running our foreign policy to a large extent, no matter who is in the White House. And so really, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Trump, it would be the military-industrial complex, the defense contractors, the weapons industries that keep pushing these wars, these conflicts. And I realized that when I was looking at Saudi Arabia and the U.S.-Saudi connection. And I also realized that this is a major country, so involved with all the conflicts in the region, and that even as a peace movement, we never took it on. And I think part of it was not wanting to fall into the Islamophobia trap and talk about Islam as a violent religion. And part of it was not knowing a lot about Saudi Arabia because it's such a society that keeps people out, except if you're a Muslim that's going for the Hajj. You can't go to Saudi Arabia unless you're also a business person that has a business sponsor inside Saudi Arabia, or you're going to work there. So, but as I traveled around the Middle East, I came into contact all the time with the influence of the Saudi ideology, and felt that it was important to really look very closely at it. And so that's why I wrote the book. And if any of you haven't heard I was speaking in a mosque last night, and there were about 70 cars in the parking lot. Somebody came in and smashed the windows on 5 of them, and including mine, and stole everything in the car, including all the books. So, sorry we don't have books. But there is a sample we can pass around, because it's an important primer written in a very simple question and answer kind of format, to get a better understanding of what is Saudi Arabia all about and why is it so important for us to focus on this country. Part of what it's all about is going back to the origins back in the 1700s, when you have this very intolerant, obscure imam who has his own fundamental interpretation of Islam, and his name is Muhammad Wahab, and he would have been just a small page in history had he not met the family of the Sauds, who were a very ambitious family that wanted to go around conquering the Arab Peninsula, taking over the Holy Lands of Mecca and Medina, and found with this ideology an excuse to go doing that. Because according to the ideology, if you are not practicing Islam the way Imam Wahab wants you to, then you are an infidel and it's okay to kill infidels. And so with that justification, they went around conquering, and in 1932 declared the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so think when you hear the word Saudi Arabia, you're thinking about a family. This is a family who has managed to hang on to power for so many decades. And when you think of how did they manage to hang on to power, that's where we come in. That's where the West comes in. Because I think that duo of the Saud family and the Wahhabs would have also gone down as a bad page in history had it not been for the discovery of oil by Western companies. In fact, the company that is now Chevron. And with the discovery of oil, the U.S. government comes in and says, we have to have a strong relationship with this kingdom. Famous meeting between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the King of Saudi Arabia in 1945, the middle of the World War, saying basically, not in these words, but we don't care what you do internally to your own people, or externally, we will make sure you do not get overthrown, as long as you let our Western companies have the access to your oil reserves and sell this oil cheap to us. So that was the foundation of oil for security that went on for so many decades. And in our country, Republican, Democratic administrations, on and on, 12 different administrations, all with some ups and downs, keeping this close relationship with the Saudi government. So meantime, what kind of society did the Saudi regime construct? It was one where there are religious police who force people to practice this kind of ideology. And I try not to say version of Islam because my Muslim friends call it a perversion of Islam. That it's not the kind of loving, compassionate Islam practiced by the vast majority of people around the world. It is indeed a perversion of Islam. But the way that it is interpreted means that there's a society that is run with an iron fist, where there's no freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. You might hear a lot of complaints by our elected officials about Iran not being a free and fair state that doesn't have democratic elections, and I always laugh because I say, why don't we ever hear them say the Saudis have no national elections at all? There's no election for a president, there's no election for an assembly or a Congress. It is a country that uses the death penalty often. Majority of the death penalty carried out by beheadings, and all kinds of non-violent reasons that you could be given the death penalty, including insulting the kingdom, insulting Islam, changing your religion from Islam, spreading atheism, being a homosexual, even being a sorcerer could give you the death penalty. The death penalty is often carried out in public squares. In fact, there's a really gruesome kind of punishment that translates as crucifixion, where they cut off the head of the person and then hang them in a public area for 3 or 4 days as a, quote, warning to the rest of the population. So when people were wondering where ISIS gets some of its ideas, they only have to look at the Saudi society. It's also a society that puts people in prison for writing blogs that are questioning the role of religion in society. There is a young man, Raif Badawi, who had a blog that was asking, why can't we have a more free-thinking, liberal society? And for his blogging, he was originally sentenced to death. Then, because of the international outcry, was commuted to 10 years and 1,000 lashes. To show that the Saudis can be pressured after they administered the first 50 lashes in a public place, the video went viral, and the Saudis were so embarrassed that they didn't administer the other 950, but they still keep this young man in prison because of his blogging. And his lawyer was given a prison sentence of 15 years. So there is no open way that people can organize for change inside Saudi Arabia. And then there are entire sectors of the population that are discriminated against, like women. So what do you think when you hear about women in Saudi Arabia?
You can't drive.
They can't drive. You know, it's funny, that's what people mostly think of, is they can't drive. And it's true, they can't drive, and it's true that it's the only country in the world where women are not allowed to drive. And there's no justification for it. You know, you ask different Saudis and you'll get a different answer from all kinds of people. The Saudi women have a simple answer, it's power trip. And the Saudi men will often say, well, it would be dangerous for them to drive and we want to keep them safe. Or they would say,
They can't go out and use each other. They go out and
they still can't go out. You couldn't have a man sitting next to you and, I'm just finishing up on the driving. But one of the funnier explanations was that there was an imam that issued a fatwa who said the women couldn't drive because it would hurt their ovaries. It would hurt their ovaries. Yeah, right. They do have to be completely covered when they go out in public. But the biggest problem is what's called this guardianship system. And this guardianship system means from the time that a girl is born to the time a woman dies, she has to have a male who's in charge of her life and can approve or disapprove of the decisions that she wants to make. So you might have an enlightened father or a very enlightened husband, or when you're older, it might be an enlightened son that is your guardian, and your life can be pretty good. But you might have an unenlightened father or husband or son, and then your life can be hell, like living in a prison. And that's why women are fighting for the right to drive. They've done civil disobedience, which means getting in a car and driving. They've done recently signing petitions, which is a risky thing to do inside Saudi Arabia, calling for a lifting of the guardianship system. Women have won a lot of rights when it comes to education, although the education is segregated. It is the most gender segregated society in the world. I really enjoyed doing the chapter on women because I wrote it with a lot of input from Saudi women. And it was interesting to see what gains they had made and how slow, excruciatingly slow, these gains have been. But there are other sectors of the population that are also discriminated against from the time they're born, and that are religious minorities. So the Saudis are a majority Sunni country, and Wahhabism is a form of Sunni religion. But there are Sunnis who don't practice their religion in the same fashion. They might be Sufis, for example. They are discriminated against if they want to practice in public. The Shia minority that lives, for the most part, in the eastern part of the country, which is the oil-rich part of the country, so you would think that they would be the ones to benefit the most from these vast reserves of oil, but no, they are a population that is constantly being put down by the government. And then there are millions of people who are not Muslims, and that is because of all the migrant, the foreign workers. So there's about 2 million Christians living in Saudi Arabia, and it is the only country where you are not allowed to build a non-Muslim place of worship. So certainly couldn't have a church, couldn't have a synagogue. In fact, until 2004, you couldn't enter the country if you were Jewish. And then I mentioned migrant workers. So important to understand that of the 30 million people in Saudi Arabia, 10 million of them are foreign workers. So a large portion of the population. And some of them are engineers that are brought in to work at the Saudi oil industry, and they have good paying jobs, and they live in compounds, and they're quite free within those compounds. But the majority of them are poor workers coming from very poor countries, coming from Bangladesh, from the Philippines, from India. And like the women and the guardianship system, it's a similar thing with foreigners. They need a sponsor inside Saudi Arabia who is basically their guardian, their owner. A worker might find that they're not getting paid what they were promised, that they're being worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, that they're not being fed decently, maybe even abused physically, maybe abused sexually. The worker says, oh my God, this is not what I bargained for, I want to go home. Can't even go home because you need an exit visa, and the only one who can sign that exit visa is your employer. So it's really like a modern day form of indentured servitude. And I mentioned that there's a religious police that, in addition to the regular police, have the authority to close down businesses, for example, at prayer time, to harass women that they don't think are covered enough. There's some wonderful videos that have been posted where the women are confronting the religious police who say, why are you wearing nail polish? And the woman saying, it's none of your business why I'm wearing nail polish. You're not a good Muslim if you wear nail polish. And she says, it's none of your business, and I am taping this, and I'm going to put this online, and it's going to go viral, and they're going to see how ridiculous you are. So, there is some pushback there, but for the most part, a very, very progressive society. And this is a society that not only is doing this to its own people, but is also pushing this to the outside world. And that's quite a new phenomenon that only came at the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And Iran, being a Shia country, was always seen as the rival to the Sunni Saudis. And after the Iranian Revolution and a theocracy comes to power in Iran, the Saudis didn't want Iran to have more influence in the Muslim world, and so started spreading their ideology. And of course they had so much money from oil that they could build thousands of mosques all over the world, they could build thousands of schools, they could bring in teachers from many countries and teach them and then send them back and continue to pay their salaries. And you saw in many countries the creeping extremism of the Saudi ideology. Even President Obama mentioned it when he talked about living in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, practicing a very tolerant, moderate form of Islam. And he said when the Saudis started coming in, you could see where their influence was. But the issue is not just spreading a fundamentalist, intolerant, anti-Western ideology, it's also funding extremist groups. And we can talk in the question part, discussion part, if you want to, about the 9/11 attacks here and the 15 to 19 hijackers being Saudis and how far up the chain does that go. But the fact of the matter is that we know that the Saudis have been funding extremist groups because in the beginning the CIA was working with them to fund a lot of these groups, like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight what was the Soviet Union at that time, which became Al-Qaeda, and the Saudis continued to fund Al-Qaeda and continue to this day to fund the Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria and in Iraq and in Libya. We know from the WikiLeaks cable that they were even funding ISIS. And our government has been putting out the notion, well, it's not the Saudi government that's doing this, it's these renegade clerics. And we can't control them, and we've told the Saudis to clamp down on them, and the Saudis are trying their hardest to do that. Well, the cables come out, and this was exchanges that came out between Hillary Clinton and John Podesta, saying it's the Saudi government. She talked about the Qatari and the Saudi government funding ISIS. So, at some point you have to really sit back and let it sink in that the country that is most responsible for spreading extremism in the world is this close ally of the United States. And here we are telling our people and telling the world that we are doing everything we can to counter extremism. We're spending millions of our dollars. We've spent the lives of our soldiers. We've disrupted major countries all over the Middle East trying to do this. and yet if you look at the fundamental basis of it, Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia itself, the government was embarrassed when it turned out that in the areas that ISIS controlled, they were using the very textbooks from Saudi Arabia because it fit their ideology. So I mentioned that oil was the foundation of this relationship, and it still is a very key part of the relationship, even though we get a lot less of our oil these days from Saudi Arabia, thanks to things like fracking. There's only 15% of the oil coming from Saudi Arabia, and it's still a very important relationship. A lot of money, and Western oil companies are very involved inside Saudi Arabia. They're very involved in joint ventures here in the United States and oil refineries in Texas. But the Saudis have also used the petrodollars to invest in other ways in the U.S. economy, and I would say partially to buy more leverage inside the U.S. And that's things like buying hundreds of billions of dollars of treasury bonds. It's buying lots of stock in major corporations, in the news media, in real estate. In fact, they have bragged about bailing Donald Trump out twice by buying some of his buildings. They have invested in companies like Uber, $3.5 billion invested in Uber, which is quite ironic given that half the population in Saudi Arabia can't drive. They also use what I call checkbook diplomacy by giving a lot of money away to buy friends in important places. And some of those important places are think tanks in the U.S. They have given to conservative, middle-of-the-road, liberal think tanks like the Brookings Institute and the Atlantic Council. Also ironic because you couldn't have a think tank in Saudi Arabia. They give to Ivy League schools, you might see. So I mentioned that oil was the foundation of this relationship, and it still is a very key part of the relationship, even though we get a lot less of our oil these days from Saudi Arabia, thanks to things like fracking. There's only 13% of the oil coming from Saudi Arabia, but it's still a very important relationship, and a lot of money, and Western oil companies are very involved inside Saudi Arabia. They're very involved in joint ventures. Also ironic because you couldn't have a think tank in Saudi Arabia. They give to Ivy League schools. You might see sometimes like entire wings of schools that are named after a Saudi prince. And the Yale Law School, for example, got $10 million from a wealthy Saudi connected to the government. Also ironic given that there's really no rule of law in Saudi Arabia. And they also buy a positive image inside the Beltway by hiring a lot of lobbyists. And those lobbyists tend to be people who used to be U.S. congresspeople, even U.S. senators, Republican, Democrat. They are, one of the big lobbyists is the Podesta Group. So Tony and John Podesta, you know, the two brothers, they started a lobby group called the Podesta Group. John Podesta went off to run Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Tony Podesta became a registered foreign agent of the Saudi government, getting $140,000 every single month to represent this incredibly repressive regime. There are the foundations that the Saudis give to, not because they are so charitable. I mean, they're so charitable they wanted to make sure that they chose the Clinton Foundation as a place to place their charitable contributions, giving between $10 and $25 million to the Clinton Foundation. They even gave money to Jimmy Carter's foundation. I was in one of those horrible hearings that I often subject myself to in Washington, D.C., where John McCain, as head of the Armed Services Committee, was doing a hearing on why can't we stop the spread of terrorism. And he goes on and on about Iran, and how Iran is spreading terrorism and trashing the Iran nuclear deal. And I remember I was biting my tongue because I had somewhere to go that day and I didn't want to get arrested, I didn't want to speak out, but it was too hard to sit there and listen to it without just, getting up and blurting out, Senator McCain, why don't you ever talk about Saudi Arabia and its role in the spread of extremism? And while he's calling the police, I have time to do a quick Google of John McCain, Saudi Arabia, and what pops up? Bloomberg News saying that his foundation just took $1 million from the Saudis. Which really makes you think like you're in some kind of crazy cuckoo land, that,
Drain the swamp.
yeah, really, drain the swamp.
Yeah.
That's it, that's what we need.